we do have that. So, okay, I'm getting to the end. Let's look at fiscal policy as an alternative to this. So here's just a quick review about it. So in the Great Recession, IMF recommended a stimulus of 2% of GDP, and the major economies introduced fiscal measures. Australia introduced one. EU also introduced some stimulus and also recommended to the member countries to have a significant fiscal stimulus. The national responses actually varied somewhat. Some countries had major spending programs, others had limited ones because they had banking crisis and there was a big use of money in combating the crisis. But then these programs were overall stopped fairly soon. They were for a limited period of time. How do we think of this in terms of analysis here, and the type of analysis I've been doing? So if we consider first make the assumption of rational quotations, the strong assumption there, then the effectiveness of different policies depends on whether the liquidity trap is caused by this kind of fundamental shock, which they usually assume, or the expectations and pessimism story. And so there are a number of studies which assume the fundamental liquidity trap, and then spending multipliers are fairly large, while cuts in taxes are relatively ineffective. There are some studies which do the alternative, the expectation-driven liquidity trap, under rational quotations, and then the fiscal policies can be different. But let me not get into the difference. Let me say, what about you could also say for the fiscal policy, it's not just a multiplier. It's you want to avoid that liquidity trap problem. You want to, and under rational quotations, you can do a strange kind of fiscal policy to eliminate that low steady state by not making it an equilibrium, which you do by something which is referred to as irresponsible fiscal policy. You make sure that longer-term budget constraints are not going to be satisfied if you follow that path. Then if agents are smart and see this, they realize that's not going to be an equilibrium, and you go somewhere else. And in their model, there's just one equilibrium left. So that's a story, but it's not a very, very good story in my view. This idea of let's be irresponsible in the short run and direct the economy in the long run. So what about in the learning point of view, which, as I said, is a more standard sort of way? So this paper by Jess Ben-Habib and George Evans has looked at this. So let's look at a very simple case. So government uses spending as the policy instrument, and let's look at the temporary fiscal expansion. So there's an increase in G taking this form that for a period it's some particular level. Then it's after, it's increased from the current period to a period T0, and then after that you return to some lower level here, lower level. So G0 is higher than G1 bar, and so here's the net one. You put all these things in, and it's announced in advance, and agents believe this announcement. And then this is just mentioning a couple of assumptions, but anyway, what you have. The basic result is here, which says that this kind of policy of a finite expansion, which is a realistic policy to assume, it may work to move the economy out of liquidity trap or to avoid a liquidity trap, but it depends on how long it is, how big it is, and also on the degree of pessimism in expectations. So let me just illustrate this pessimism issue. That if you assume that expectations are below the low steady state, somewhat below that, similarly for the other variable, and then you have a policy for 2 years, these are quarters, so T0 is 8, and you have a 10% in expansion in government spending, and so normal level is 0.2 in these numbers, and you increase it by 10%, then you converge back to the target steady state. But it is sensitive in the sense that suppose and here's a figure of that. So the economy starts from here. It has fairly wide fluctuation, but it cyclically converges to the. But suppose you have more pessimism, inflation. Agents expect more deflation here. Then there is divergence. I can't really draw it in this two-dimensional, but here's just what happens for the inflation. You actually start low. It gradually goes first, and then the deflation deepens. So that's the answer, is that it depends on the success of a fiscal expansion depends very much on where the economy is, how much is the stimulus, and how long is the stimulus. I have a paper here, so I do a little bit of advertising, which is that, hopefully in a few weeks' time, it's going to be on our website, a paper where we look at this systematically, and in a model with random shocks, because the random shocks can be a pretty interesting part of the story. So, because something which looks like a successful fiscal policy, so that it gets you out of the liquidity trap, may not be if you have fairly adverse random shocks. So you can actually calculate sort of success rates of a given fiscal policy from some given starting point of the economy, given initial condition of the economy. And what you get the sort of results that you may need fairly significant fiscal expansion, but for a limited period. Very long fiscal expansions don't work. And so forth. So there are various interesting features. It's an elaborate paper, so I'm not going to try to summarize it more here, except to say that it's coming, and it's basically saying, if you go back a few to this figure, is that suppose if you're very close to this boundary between instability and stability, then a little bit, and luckily with some good reasonable shocks, you'll get to this region, and if you don't get big shocks on that way, then you converge. But then on the other hand, if you're here, you need a lot of fiscal expansion and luck with shocks as well to be able to get back. So it allows these kinds of calculations to be done systematically, that paper.